Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to have a conversation about AI and its dynamic, changing role and where you think it fits in with schools who are using a concept-based inquiry approach. So Rachel, let's start with you. What opportunities do you see for AI to enhance teaching and learning?
Well, for teaching, of course, it's like a great brainstorming model, I think, and so you can, like I'm at a school right now that has a lot of neurodivergent learners, so you could take something and say, how does this work best for dyslexic? How does this work best for ADHD? And also just like as a time saver too, to, like I said, like just brainstorming a quick Google put together. So I feel like even if you don't have, like I've been in scenarios where I haven't had a team, like I'm very lucky I have a team this year, but was at a school where I was the only 7th grade teacher. So had I had AI as a possibility, then it might have been something else besides my own thoughts that I had. So, and as far as students, I think there's going to be a need for them to understand how it works, which I think could be amazing, coming up with concepts and generalizations about AI and LLMs in particular right now for students. But I think too, like there's two, it's kind of double-edged sword, right? There's so many opportunities for them to have independent inquiry and to be working on what is a good question. So like I was saying earlier, is like the example of developing questions with students. So I did this inquiry with students, with 2 teachers that were leading different history classes. And so the students were inquiring into the Bill of Rights and ancient Egypt. And so they kind of started out with their first question, and it could be whatever. And they all agreed on it as a class, but you had to come up with 3 things that were interesting that the ChatGPT gave you as an answer. But in order to do that, you have to have an answer that's going to be more than just a 1-word or a 1 sentence. So right off the bat, you're kind of starting to develop of what is a good question. And at the same time, you're teaching children how to prompt well. So it's kind of both things.
Well, AI is only as useful as whatever you feed into it.
Right.
And so the students are going to be using these tools in the future, whether we invite them to or not.
Exactly.
So let's teach them to use them well.
Yeah, exactly. And to think about the weaknesses of it right away too. I think making that obvious right away is so important because I mean, there's still some kids that like, oh, my source is Google, like 6th grade, and that's still what they say. And it's like, well, now it's going to be, oh, my source is ChatGPT. It's like, whoa.
Oh, yeah, well, that's even more risky because at least with Google, you knew what page you were pulling it from. Whereas ChatGPT, you don't even necessarily know its original source.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, interesting. So, Ijanaya, tell us a little bit more about the challenges that come with that and what students need to be aware of as they start to move into this world of intellectual property and AI.
Yes. I think what is a big challenge for students is understanding conceptually what artificial intelligence is. Because as you mentioned before, they don't understand that it is not a source of information. It is gathering information from multiple sources. And so that's a huge challenge that I have with students, is that they think because they put a prompt in and it gives them a response that they are now the owners of that information, and they either credit themselves or they credit ChatGPT, or they don't even think they need to credit anyone because they in their minds have created that information. I think in connection with that and integrity, I think what's important is helping students understand the ethical implications of using text generative tools and not stating outrightly that they did, or that when they're using these tools, some of which are better than others, they aren't necessarily getting the sources for that information, which is a huge concern in terms of copyright and intellectual property and the ownership of that information, where it's coming from and who to credit that information to.
And so it's kind of taken us into this unknown territory pretty rapidly, actually. It was a pretty fast change, and one that we didn't necessarily, we all knew it was coming, but we didn't realize how good it would be this quickly.
Right.
And so it creates these kind of times of unknown where our students, we can't just pause and go, just give us a couple of years to figure this out, and then we'll come back to you on it. They have access to these tools.
It's quite interesting, the phases that we go through when these new technologies appear. And I can't credit the author, but the term is culture lag. So technology leads us, and then the society tries to work out how to integrate it. So we move from, in the case of many schools that I've heard about, it's forbidden. It was forbidden for a year at our school, and then this year it has to be referenced. You have to say that you've used it, and then I think eventually we'll get to that stage where we coexist in a healthy way with it, and I think we're still kind of evolving into that, and I think there's many cases of educational technology where we go, well, it's going to change things completely, and then they don't. And as Rasha said, it was like I think it was Rasha who said our goal is still the same. Our goal is to educate, and so when these new tools come online, then we go, okay, how do we shift direction? How do we redirect students? Because I actually didn't think it'll be that big a deal. I thought it would be like, oh, this is going to blow over. And then I started getting work that was clearly sourced from somewhere else. The machine had aggregated it, and it came out, and it's like, this is not you. And that was the forbidden stage. And then this year, I'd say it's probably still got under my radar, but what students actually really needed was a clarity of the instruction, where it would prohibit them, or kind of the AI technology would be sidelined, because they would need to link it, they would need to make it relevant, they'll need to say there's something that happened to me in my context, and that is where it was easy to spot who had actually had help with it.
I think the power of the CBI approach too is because you are having to make these links in the deeper thinking, and so the chances that your assignment or whatever could be done by AI is much lower when it's this type of teaching. So like that's been one of the big feedbacks, like, well, the kids are going to cheat. It was like, well, if they can just cheat, maybe we need to have a new assignment.
Exactly. It puts the pressure on teachers to ask different kinds of questions, right? And to ask questions that AI can't necessarily produce an answer for. But also we need to be teaching students how to use it, because it is a powerful tool. I mean, I'm using ChatGPT all the time, and so if I use it all the time, why shouldn't students use it? But I also have the skills to go, no, that's not what I want to say, or that word doesn't sound like me, and so I can use it in a way that it doesn't necessarily feel like someone else has done the writing for me. It's used almost as a, co-author on it. Often it's on emails or on things that I want to write to, website descriptions and things, but I often say, no, that sounds too ChatGPT, and we want our kids to be able to go, well, what does that mean? Like, the language is too markety and pushy, and it doesn't sound right, and so, how will a human audience respond to that? Yes, that wording might sound good, but it also sounds over the top. So.
Do you really use dynamic that much?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, giving students the skills to say, yes, you are allowed to use this, but if you're going to use it, let's use it well, and not just take the first response that not even doesn't sound like a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old, but doesn't sound like your intended audience wants to read. So thinking about who is your audience, and is this the kind of language that they would use, and some of those things. I know you can tell ChatGPT to write it for a different audience, but really kind of drilling into some of those things as well.
I found it, I used it probably the first time to ask the AI the same question I was asking the students, which is like, what would someone write about a day in the Industrial Revolution? And it was like, hey, this is pretty good. I mean, maybe I can show that to the students. So as part of the assessment, we asked for 3, but you have to be the same person. So that made it more tricky for them for the computer to write that. But it was good to get an example, and it looked. I guess you can change the parameters, like what age, what audience is it for, and then that would further fine tune it.
So let's kind of switch track a little bit. We've talked a lot about students and how students may or may not use them and some of the challenges around that. But what about curriculum writing and curriculum design? Someone asked me a while back, well, can ChatGPT write a good concept-based inquiry unit? And I've tried quite a few times, and there's some good things in there, but so far it hasn't really gone, wow, that's a great unit, I would use that. But one of the interesting things I have found is I put in the conceptual questions that we've written and then say, well, what's the answer? Is it the generalization that we want to get to? And oftentimes it's not. And so when you ask, just like you're saying, ask ChatGPT to, or whatever AI tool you're using, to come up with a model, ask them your conceptual question. It will tell you if you're asking the right question or not, because if ChatGPT can't get to the kind of answer that you're looking for, the problem could be the question that we're asking. So have any of you used it in crafting any type of curriculum?
Right, but we had a conversation about this in the think tank, and I often find that I spend more time trying to get it to where I want it to be, because, and we talked about this, there's a lack of understanding of the context that I'm teaching in, or what the students that I'm trying to teach for. And so I find it quite trivial when I'm trying to get ChatGPT or any other text generative tool to help me with that curriculum or that planning of that lesson. I think that there's a loss of that human aspect that I have when I connect with my students. And the understandings that I want them to have, that it just doesn't get to that point, at least in my experience.
No, I found the same.
I felt it's been pretty successful for some of this stuff. Yeah. Well, I mean, so mine was very literature, so maybe that's also like the context and what I was looking at too. But I wanted to have looking at identity, and we were looking at the Weston game, and I was like, all right, I want it to be a concept of who I am, basically. And so it was really good, and I was like, I want it to be a 6-week unit plan, and I kind of described my class. So like it was like a good, like, I'd say, paragraph of a prompt. And then it came back and I was like, can you make it more student-centered? And then I got that, and so then it was kind of learning to continue on the conversation and like break down the pieces. So then like whatever was missing, I could ask for it, and then I could get there. So again, it was another, like, I didn't necessarily have my team, but that became my team right there. And so like it was a pretty decent unit, and then sharing with other teachers. So it's like, I think if we think of it as another layer of a partner, then that's a good, like a positive starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. As a collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've used it for a couple different too. Like we were doing a unit on immigration, and I wanted the students to be able to take an action. We were particularly looking at DC. So then I was like, okay, and I started there first, like, what are the like major immigrant groups within the Washington DC area, and where do they live? And it knows all of that too. And so then, okay, I can take that information and I can kind of Google where that came from, and then all of a sudden I'm at George Mason's source, and I have all this new information too. So a lot of it is like ourselves as teachers and students to be like, okay, you have this, now fact check the information and then find a source.
Yes.
It's almost like everything's going to be backwards engineering. Right.
To actually then find the source and then decide if that source is credible. Yeah, absolutely.
Like we're so much faced with, is it true anyways?
Yeah.
Right now, so that's might be just a good skill in general.
I haven't actually tried this. Can you say to ChatGPT, what's your source?
Okay, so when you put in a prompt, you can ask for sources, but sometimes it'll be something, because it's like a couple of years back, so sometimes it doesn't exist anymore when you go.
It's working off of 2021,
right.
Yeah, so it's not as up to date as other text generating tools. And I have tried that. I've actually tried to get it to create references for me, and it says no, I can't. I got this from different sources, or something very vague like that. But I have used other text generating tools that were able to provide me with references, and I checked them and they were okay. And then some that provide references and they're made up.
Oh, interesting.
Completely made up. They don't exist. And so there's this, I think that's one of the things that I was concerned about as well, is that I know how to check that, and I'm going to take the extra steps to check all of that, but students often don't.
So that's another one of the skills that we need to be
That's
teaching.
a skill that they need to be taught when we're teaching how do you find reputable sources, how do you identify reputable sources, how do you navigate all of the information that's out there and make sure there is a source.
Yeah, and this point came up earlier, which I hadn't thought about before. So if AI is simply aggregating what is available, then how do we build it out so that there's more of
So there's
other
new ideas out
cultures
there.
and other worldviews, and if they're not able to be extracted, then have we really covered the topic? And I think that's not my idea, but I have thought about that because it also plays into that attribution. It's a certain worldview to want to attribute things, to copyright them, to own them, when what we have is trying to reach a collective understanding.
It's interesting you say that, because earlier today we were having a conversation that was very similar, but it was about what books are available in the library. And so it's the same kind of thing, but now on a bigger global scale, to say, are we still drawing on a very Western view of the world, or are we able to start to integrate different worldviews?
And there was a really good example of that, actually. I didn't think of it earlier, but then I was thinking of the case studies that I'm using with my students now. And recently there was a big conversation about indigenous groups that were holding fashion design companies accountable, and they were, I think, suing for copyright infringement because they were using indigenous designs to create their own designs. So it's not really so much, in my mindset, of a Western perspective. It's a lack of that conceptual understanding in developed or developing countries. They don't understand ownership, maybe because things have been taken for so long, that it's not something that is conceptually understood, but it doesn't mean that it's not able to be understood by different other than Western world countries. It's just something that's just not known yet or prevalent yet, or they don't understand their rights pertaining to copyright and intellectual property yet.
Yeah.
Bouncing off to kind of go back with the bias of the information, it's like, what was the model trained on? What is available? Who made the model? Like, what did they decide was important? Because you think, you can go back and look at some different AIs of like facial recognition, right? And like how much bias and racism there's been built into some of these things just because they only were thinking about one certain group of people when they made it. And so then all of a sudden you get new users in different contexts, and it's like, this doesn't make sense. Or what ideas are we pushing up? Because like, oh, well, the pattern recognized this to be the most common thing, so this is, but what if it's an old theory that we have now don't think is the most relevant anymore, or specifically keeps other students' voice out of the conversation if we use that data? So that's like another layer of things for students and teachers to be aware of.
I think these battle lines are very familiar, and I don't have the answer, but I think we've been through this before. But it's new. It's still new territory. What's emerging is it may be a different world.
Well, this will be showing my age, but when I went to university, we had all search engines blocked on the computer labs in the library, so you couldn't use Google, or probably Google wasn't around as the search engine of choice at that time, but you couldn't use any search engines. So you could use computers to access Word, or you could access email, but you couldn't access any. And so it was the same kind of idea of like, universities at that time were blocking all search engines. Now you think about the way that they provide huge access to a wealth of journals and research and things through the internet. And I guess it's the same sort of idea of like, you were talking about it earlier, we just haven't caught up, we haven't figured it out yet, but we will. We just need to be having more conversations like this to say, what are the challenges, what are the advantages, how do we navigate this, how do we support students through it, the challenges for these students who are in it right now and where we haven't quite figured it out yet.
I'd be curious too, adding more student voice to it, because I feel like some of this stuff, it's like, it's harder for some teachers to get in it, but like they've actually been using it in their games, right? There's some that are already AI asking questions back to the students, and so that's very familiar. And so that's the other part, is as we develop, it's kind of being open, that maybe they know more than us.
And there's a lot of amazing personalized learning tools where educators who are embracing it are making really personalised learning where the students aren't getting their answers from AI, the questions are coming from AI in response to the answers that the students are giving. So there's a lot of exciting potential too. And it's about sort of jumping on and seeing what's possible and trying things out and keeping an open mind. So, well, thank you all for being here today to be a part of this conversation in a pretty complex world. It'll be interesting to look back on this conversation in 3 or 4 years as a time capsule of what we were thinking, like, I can't believe I said that. But, you know, it marks a point in time and where we're at in education. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.